Korea is the priciest place to raise children from birth to the age of 18 in terms of average income. Now, China has been found to rank second and Italy third. This is according to research by Jefferies Financial Group, which looked into 14 different countries. For more, I have Frank Smith with Deutsche Welle live on the line. Frank, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Good to be here. Thanks, Sunny.
I also have freelance journalist Jack Barton here in the studio. Jack, it's good to see you again.
It's great to be here.
Right, Frank, we'll start with you. Let's begin then with a bit more details about this particular research, which was reported by CNN last week.
Well, it came from the Jefferies Financial Group Incorporated, and it analyzed spending on childcare up to the age of 18 as a percentage of GDP, gross domestic product. It looked at this kind of in a broad context to try to put this into perspective, you know, when you're analyzing across country with different metrics. So, for example, in the West, college education, often young people, they'll take out loans. And so that wasn't really factored in to the expense that parents paid in the education of their children. And also it looked at the taxation a little bit and the provision of public and private services. And what I found really most interesting was that the Jefferies Financial Group is a financial services company that really concentrates on wealth management. And you'd think that it would have sort of a very conservative perspective on issues like this, on social issues like this. And in fact, it advocated an increase in terms of state provisions for childcare, which you'd find astonishing. It also pinpointed, especially China and South Korea, for being high on that spending category of those up to 18. Sunhee?
Right, and staying with that then, Jack, like Frank just mentioned, countries in the Far East, that is South Korea and China, top the list, standing at first and second place respectively, followed by Italy in third place. What are your personal thoughts on these findings?
I think there's a number of factors. One is, as Frank mentioned, it's comparative per capita of GDP. So we're not talking about it being the most expensive, but being the most expensive in terms of an income that the parents have. So over here it's more than $100,000. In China it's about $75,000 to raise a child to 18. If you told that to someone in America that only have to spend $75,000, they'd be jumping for joy, probably planning a family of 5. But here in China those are bigger costs. Another factor is that outside of East Asia, in most countries, people tend to aim for bigger families. One of the reasons, because those comparative costs are lower, so maybe a family of 2 or 3. But here you see parents having far fewer families, and you know, South Korea amongst one of the lowest birth rates in the world, if not the lowest. So when they do have a child, they tend to be willing to spend more on that child as well. And then one of the factors that play into that here, of course, is the incredible tutoring that goes on in South Korea. When I describe to people back in Australia how much out-of-school hour tutoring goes on here and the expense involved, they don't actually even believe me. So that all adds up more. And then, of course, there is childcare before they go to school. I know the government's tried to make it free, but we know that people are spending about 198,000 won, or about $162 a month on that. So all of those costs adding up really to make this a very, very pricey place to raise a child.
Right. Jack, the universal understanding is that childcare is expensive everywhere. And keeping in mind what Jack himself has said, Frank, what do you believe is the reason behind this particular reality here in the Far East then?
Well, I think we might have to go back to a Confucian influence in terms of education. South Koreans in particular are obsessed with education and childhood education. And so I think that plays into it. As Jack mentioned, he talked about private education institutes, what are called hagwon here in South Korea, and the propensity of parents to send them to several different institutes and have several different tutors come into the home basically on a weekly basis. And really there's kind of no ceiling to that. Also, I think in South Korea you have stronger familial responsibilities. I think families are a little bit closer knit here, so there is that I think degree of responsibility in terms of parenting is a little bit stronger here in South Korea, perhaps than in the West, where you might say to your 10-year-old child, you know, go out of the house and play around and come back when the sun comes down. South Koreans really don't have that kind of attitude and keep their children on a much shorter leash.
Right. Jack, speaking within your capacity as a well-traveled journalist, then, how do you explain Italy's high expenses in child rearing?
Because Italy, in many ways, is very similar to Korea and China. It has a very low birth rate, the lowest in Europe. It is very pricey there. There's a huge bureaucracy, and while the cost of secondary education is perhaps a little bit cheaper than here, the cost of childcare there is astronomical. So if you look at the north of Italy, I mean, we mentioned about $162 a month here. In the north of Italy, it's more closer to $670 a month. Even in the south, which is much poorer, it's still about $450 a month in childcare. So you do have all of these pressures. You have wages that are very similar to South Korea. So the average per capita wage is very similar. And so when we look at the actual dynamics, even though Italy is sitting in there in the European Union, in Europe, when we crunch the numbers down, it's actually very similar. The social circumstances are similar. The financial circumstances are very similar to South Korea.
Right. And back here in South Korea then, Frank, keeping in mind the causes of the costly childcare here in the country that you shared, what do you recommend as part of efforts to ease this financial burden, so to speak?
Well, I would agree with the sort of rough conclusions that came out of this report. Expand and improve the public education and community services system. If we look at, we've got to look at this in sort of a comprehensive way. To just pinpoint one thing I don't think is quite fair. We need to look at the tax rates in South Korea, 37% personal tax, 25% corporate tax, and look specifically at the social welfare spending, which in South Korea is, pretty close to the bottom of the OECD at just about 12.2%. And then the household benefits that are paid out of that is at the very bottom of those countries reporting data. So I would argue that South Korea needs to consider, increasing perhaps its taxation and investing that money in public education and public community services.
Right. Well, Jack, people say it takes a village to raise a child. And keeping in mind what Frank has just said, do you suppose the government here does need to shoulder a heavier burden?
I do think that the government needs to shoulder a heavier burden, but there also needs to be a cultural shift as well. There's always a big race in South Korea to get into those big three universities. We know the names, the SK and the Y, and perhaps too much attention is focused, and so too much money is spent trying to get the children into those areas. If there was a more level playing field in terms of high schools, in terms of universities, if there was more a sense of, getting a piece of paper that will get you a good job from many other educational institutions, I think there'd be a lot less pressure, a lot less money spent, and part of that would be, a large part of that would come through a government effort to ensure there was quality education right across the boards at many institutions, even though at the moment there might be, and the perception might be just that you're getting it at those few. So definitely, look, there always education. There needs to be more money spent on education because that ensures a prosperous next generation. Education and infrastructure and health are always the key. But at the same time, I think there needs to be a bit of a cultural shift here as well.
Right. Frank, this research by Jefferies Financial Group looked into the costs of feeding, clothing, educating, as well as entertaining children. Now, with regard to the latter, that is entertaining children, what are your thoughts on the availability of affordable entertainment venues for children here in South Korea?
Well, I just want to go back first to comment a little bit on what Jack said, and I really agree with what he said. And, young people here are being educated, very highly, as we mentioned, but it's being divided between public and private, too much on the private end, and that doesn't result in what we want to see, which in a democracy, in a meritocracy, which is equal opportunity. Now, when we talk about, entertainment services, many of them are private. I look out my window, I live in a high-rise here, there's a lot of density in terms of, living space, residential living space, but a very small playground for my apartment in a private area. And a public playground and public facilities are a little bit few and far between comparatively. So I think South Korea could really do a lot more in terms of public park space, public play areas. If we talk about, say, swimming pools, I have to, get in a car to go to a private swimming pool. And, free open swimming, when I was a child, for example, I could walk to a swimming pool 2 blocks or a few blocks in a couple of directions to get to one, and I could go to free open swimming. I wouldn't have to register for a class. I could go to free open swimming any sort of day. I myself taught tennis for a community center that was heavily subsidized by the government, so that anybody with just a few dollars to spend could spend some time in sort of tennis recreation. So I think South Korea could really learn a lesson in terms of broadening its social community spending. Sunhee?
Right. Jack, beyond Korea, your country, Australia, ranked quite favorably on that particular list. Now, child rearing in Australia was found to cost 2.1 times in the country's average GDP per capita. Do you care to explain this reality over in Australia for us?
Yeah, of course, that's much lower than South Korea or China or other. But there's fairly simple reasons behind this. One is that we have some of the highest wages in the world. In fact, we have the highest minimum wage in the world at almost $15. That's about 2/3 higher than even in the United States. But also on top of that, there's very good state-funded education, and there's a lot of trust in it. So private schools exist. Private schools are expensive. People with the money might be inclined to send their children there, but that's not to say that if you want to be the Prime Minister or a CEO of a company, you actually have to go to one of those schools. You can just as easily have come from a state school, and state schools will cost you anywhere up to $500 a year in fees. So, the fees are so low you could almost say they're almost non-existent, and on top of that you have very, very high income. But apart from that, I would say it's more on the trust in state institutions, and it's more on the high level of education in state institutions that is a much bigger fact than the actual income.
Right, and here's the million-dollar question then, Jack. How do you suppose was that trust in state institutions fostered?
By spending in state institutions, by trying to attract good teachers into state institutions. And obviously in the private schools, there's always going to be an imbalance there because they will be able to pay a little bit more, but the quality of teachers is high. State schools try to attract, and some of the state schools try a little harder than others. In fact, there's one state school in Melbourne that essentially has the same reputation as a private school, if not better. So people try and compete to get into this state school. But overall, it's a very level playing field. What you might get in a private school is a little bit more specialized education, particularly when it comes to music or the arts or this sort of thing. But across the board, when we're talking about maths, sciences, you're likely to get just as good an education in a state school. And that's a very conscious policy. It's not a chance. And Australia is used to be at least, an egalitarian society, and there'd be a sense of outrage if the schools didn't function in that way.
Right. Frank, now I understand you've been away from your country, Canada, for quite a while now, but could you share with us a bit about the cost of child rearing in Canada and the support perhaps available to working parents there?
Well, working parents in Canada get a child stipend of $500 per month per child. So it does get some support there. And also when we talk about those other programs surrounding school, for example, here in South Korea, my daughter goes to school from 9 to 12 usually, sometimes 9 to 2, but usually just 9 to 12, and then it's perhaps an after-school program. Whereas when I grew up in Canada, I went to school from 9 o'clock until 3 o'clock. And then in my elder grades, in grade 5, 6, 7 in elementary school, I could play on teams and stay busy in the afternoons as well. So the school day here is much shorter. And I think, to reiterate what Jack was saying about trust, I don't think the South Korean public and South Korean parents really trust the public school system. And that's one of the reasons that they do so much private tutoring. Often, educators would kind of point out that children are sleeping when they go to public education, and then they wake up to really study hard and take seriously their studies at private institutes, at academies, at hagwons here.
Right.
So
now, Frank, you've set yourself up now. I'm going to ask you a difficult question. Based on your observations then, as a foreigner looking into the academic situation here in the country, what do you suppose is the reason perhaps for this lack of trust within the public education here in the country?
Well, I think it's something that really developed over time. You know, I would say that the privatization of the education system and that happened over time. It's not something that you can dial back easily. You have very strong vested interest groups in the private education sector that want to see their market protected. Fixing that is going to take the kind of private spending that they do in Australia. There's no such thing as a free lunch. Jack pointed out very accurately the priorities that the government in Australia has in making private education and public education, and specifically public education, equal in terms of its quality. And that's going to be expensive.
Right. And Jack, back to you then. So it's been established by this latest research that Korea is the most expensive country to raise a child in terms of average income. Having said that, is it money well spent in terms of education, do you think?
Well, I think this all feeds into something that, Frank was just talking, and you were talking about why is it the imbalance, and I think some of it has come from the history of Korea. If we look at the development of the economy and of the education system, it's come so recently and so fast, and of course the private schools were some of the first to establish big educational institutions, so it was natural that they got a lot of kudos. But now if we move forward, I would say part of me wants to say any amount of money spent on education is money well spent, but the other half of me thinks that if you're spending all of that money just to get your child into the right university, and then once they get in there, it's just, okay, we'll just study enough now to pass, having the bit of paper with the university name on, that's the important thing. I'd kind of say, no, it's not money well spent. Because you're not, university is where you really need to focus and get that quality the quality information that you're seeking. And the other thing is there's too much focus on rote learning, and that feeds into this cram tutoring. So you're not getting a critical thinking, good critical thinking in the education system. And for South Korea, that is so important, because you're not going to get good high-tech science research and development without that focus in the education system. So there's too much focus on rote learning just to get you into one of these universities, and not enough attention paid, of course, to getting into a multitude of well-funded universities, and then focusing in the university and focusing not just on what you're learning but how you're learning it, to be more critical about what you're learning, so when you come out you've really got that mind that can develop new things for the country.
Right. And not that I disagree with you, but Frank, keeping in mind what Jack has just said, there are pundits there who do claim that the availability of such private institutions for education, which also include quite a lot of subjects not covered at school. For example, you could have dancing classes taught in English for your child if he or she is interested in it. And that kind of exposure, that kind of availability has, in essence, pushed our economic standard to world levels. What are your thoughts on that, Frank?
Well, I agree with you. I think, something like dancing or, let's say Taekwondo, that's very popular here, being serviced by private education, private institutes, is a great idea. What I think we see too much of is things like math and science and English language study done at private institutes that could be and should be in a sort of equanimous society, an egalitarian society, done in the private education system. And that's, again, what I would advocate.
Right. Frank, with regard to money well spent then, in terms of ensuring a safe environment for child growth, what are your thoughts?
There's no ceiling to what you will spend. I'll use the analogy that we use in politics, talking about national security. There's no ceiling to what a country will spend to ensure its national security. And as a parent, there's no ceiling to what I'll spend in terms of my daughter's education. I'd like to see her, do more of that in school. And also, I think it's important to recognize what Jack mentioned about what they're studying, how they're studying as young people. There's too much rote learning going on and too much emphasis placed on education as a young person. And then when they have that, mental and social capacity to discuss and learn more complicated things, they're considered to be already sort of done when they get into their freshman university and junior university years, when they should be really dialing up that critical thinking education.
Right. Hopefully there will be improvements in the future, of course, then. Frank, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Jack here in the studio, thank you for your insights today.